Hi, folks. I wanted to help you all understand the major theoretical perspectives better. So, to back up further and think about theories, one of the things that we need to understand is what a theory is. And I like to think of a theory as a general perspective or a worldview. It's a set of views and expectations. It's a paradigm that helps us to look at the world and understand the world around us. In sociology, we generally talk about three major paradigms, but I always like to cover five. So your book has three, but I want to cover the five major theoretical paradigms. And let me just go over those quickly and then break them down further. So the five major perspectives, theoretical perspectives, are functionalism, also called structural functionalism, conflict theory, sometimes called Marxist or critical theory, symbolic interactionism, and the other two that I'm going to cover that are not in your textbook are feminist theory and exchange theory. So let's go over the three major ones first, and then I'll add on my discussion about feminism and exchange theory at the end. A functionalist theory is going to argue that society is made up of interrelated and interdependent parts that work together to create stability, harmony, and order. So, some of the key words or phrases you might think about from a functionalist perspective when they're looking at the world, they're saying the whole is greater than its parts. All of these parts are interdependent. They're all interconnected. They're all interrelated. So anytime you see those kind of words, it's probably a functionalist viewpoint. If they're focusing on keeping the society stable, harmonious, orderly, then that is a functionalist perspective. If you think about it, functionalism is a very, what I would call, conservative perspective. And I don't mean like Republican or Democrat. I mean conservative as in they want to conserve or preserve things the way they are. That's what stability means, right? Functionalists talk about manifest and latent functions. They argue that everything has a function. Another term for function would be purpose, that even some terrible things for a functionalist serve a purpose. And they would ask, what is the purpose or function of these different things? A manifest function's the primary or intended function. The latent function would be a secondary or an unintended function. So the example I like to give for that is the primary function of sending children to school is that they learn and they get an education. A secondary function is that school provides childcare for a lot of parents. We're certainly seeing that in this pandemic era when many parents are struggling because they don't know what to do with their kids and they still have jobs to go to. So we are in this crisis of care because the education system is no longer fulfilling the latent function of providing us with childcare. You could also argue it helps kids to learn socialization. But again, those are not your primary reasons for being there. That's to learn, to get an education. And that's the manifest function. Conflict theory is very different. So conflict theorists are going to argue that society is driven by this constant competition and conflict over scarce resources. So we're in a society where everybody wants a piece of the pie. That's how you can think of these resources, right? But there's not enough pie for everybody to get some. And so what occurs is this struggle over this pie. Who gets to have a giant piece, and then who ends up with crumbs, and then who ends up with nothing. Conflict theory is influenced by Marxist theory. And Karl Marx says that when we have capitalism creates this system of inequality. So from a conflict viewpoint, they're going to look at things like the haves and the have-nots, which we also call the bourgeoisie, they're the haves, and the proletariat, they're the have-nots. And so they think the struggle, right, is between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Marx's very technical definition of the bourgeoisie is the owners of the means of production. And in a capitalist society, that means business owners. The technical definition of the proletariat would be the workers, those people who work for the capitalists. So, the person who owns McDonald's is part of the bourgeoisie. Everyone, including the managers and the guy who runs the drive-through, are part of the bourgeoisie in Marx's perspective. They are the workers, right? And they are working for this corporation. They're working for the bourgeoisie, right? The owners who run the corporation. So anytime you see a conflict perspective, you're going to see a lot of emphasis on scarce resources, inequality. And a very important element of this is that Marx not only thought we had this struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, but he thought that we should challenge that we should work to change that. And he believed that this created great inequality and that it was the responsibility of a social scientist to work to challenge or change that inequality that we have in our system. So when you think about conflict theory, you're looking for words like competition, conflict, inequality, change, scarce resources, struggle. You might hear something about class or class consciousness. Marx talks a lot about your socioeconomic standing. Often, conflict theory has a critique of capitalism. So they might say something like, the workers at the drive-thru at McDonald's are being exploited, and the capitalist system doesn't allow them to fulfill some of their basic needs like good quality health care. And meanwhile, the bourgeoisie, the owner of McDonald's, is getting all of this money, right? And has more money than they need and has no problem taking care of their children or their health care while the workers struggle. So that's a conflict perspective that we see. So the next perspective is very different. If you look at functionalism and conflict side by side, if you print out the handouts that I've given you or you've taken notes, you should notice a lot of opposite words, right? Like one's for stability, one's for change. One talks about competition and conflict, and the other one talks about order and harmony. This is different from the third perspective that I want to talk about. The third perspective is called the Symbolic Interactionist perspective. The Symbolic Interactionist perspective in sociology focuses a lot on signs, symbols, perceptions, values, and in particular this idea of shared meanings. A symbolic interactionist, which is often talked about in terms of social psychology, is going to focus a lot on how we as a people create shared meanings. How do we communicate with each other? So just let me give you a random example of something that's right next to me. I have in my hand. You might know this. You might have seen one of these. Maybe not. I don't know. We call this a scrunchie. My daughter says it makes me a visco girl, which I'm not 100% sure what that is, but they have scrunchies. That's a name for this. Some of you may not know that. Some of you may know this. But if I said, go get a scrunchie, and you knew what it meant, you would go get this. When you see this, I hope anyways, when you see this, you know that it's a device to hold your hair back. So I'm going to use my scrunchie. I'm going to put my hair back. And now that's what I did with that object. Well, somebody somewhere does not know what that is. Maybe there are some cultures where they don't have scrunchies. And so they don't have a word for that, right? So for example, every language has a different word for these things. And in order for us to communicate, in order for us to relate to each other and understand each other, we have to be able to have these shared meanings. And that brings up a very important point. So while symbolic interactionists are looking at signs, symbols, perceptions, values, shared meanings, interactions, they're going to come back and say, if you want to understand a culture, the key element of any culture is its language. So symbolic interactionists believe language is very important. And language is the ultimate form of symbols. Language is the ultimate form of shared meanings. And it's very important to understand when we think about language, language just isn't the words that we write, it's the gestures that we use when we say this, which I think usually means come here. Although there's some other culture where it means something very vulgar and it's insulting, right? So it's our body language, it's our gestures, it's our demeanor. If I come to class and I look like this, I'm very sad and you all are reading my demeanor and my body language. So don't think of language as just words. It could be how loud you talk, how quiet you talk. It could be the way you move. So language is the totality of who we are and how we communicate and how we understand the world around us. They also talk a lot about how we come to understand the self and who we are as individuals. So they would look at self-development, the way we develop a self, the way we learn to understand how we fit in the world. They're going to talk a lot about those kind of things. Feminism is a very broad range of perspectives. There's not one type of feminism. There are many types of feminism. If you were to take my Sociology 208 class, Sociology of Gender, you would learn a bunch of those different types of feminist perspectives. But for the purposes of an intro to sociology class, I'm going to make the case that feminism shares a couple important principles, that all feminists, regardless of their strain of feminism, believe a couple things. One thing they believe is that gender and gender inequality are real. And the next thing that they believe is that we should challenge gender and gender inequality. So for feminists, gender is going to be at the center of the discussion. And they would say that in order to understand, a particular form of inequality, and usually they're going to focus on gender, we have to look at how gender is created, how it's maintained, how it's constructed, how it creates inequality. Sometimes feminism overlaps a little bit with conflict theory, if you think about that inequality perspective. Sometimes it overlaps a little bit with symbolic interactionism when we talk about the meaning of gender. So for example, there's a big debate about should we create a more diverse set of gendered pronouns? Should we have a gender neutral pronoun? And some people have suggested the term Z or they or zer. I've heard a few different variations of it. Right now we have he and she. Should we add ze, by the way, for those of you who haven't heard about that? They are thinking about how the language shapes how we see gender. And in that case, feminism and symbolic interactionism are overlapping. But again, the key point for feminists is looking at how these things are gendered and how gender influences things like our jobs, our family relationships, our education system. Another important perspective that feminists tend to add is this idea of what I'm going to call standpoint theory. This comes from a book called Black Feminist Thought by Patricia Hill Collins. And she argues that we all sort of have our own standpoints in the hierarchies of society, and that it's not just gender that is important, but that gender intersects with other forms of inequality. So when we talk about things like age, religion, disability, race, ethnicity, I'm probably forgetting some, sexuality, I'll list all these different things, right? That you are not only a woman or a man, but, for example, I am a white, middle-class, American, heterosexual woman. I all of those things shape my standpoint. My standpoint is my perspective, my place in the hierarchy. It also affects how other people see me, right? My standpoint is where I see the world, but it's also where other people see me. And if you changed any one of those things about me, you would see me in a different light. If you changed my race, if you changed my class, if you changed my age. And so I think it's very important for us to think in complicated ways about inequality. And that has been a critique of early feminism, that it focused only on gender, and it didn't think enough about how gender works with other systems of inequality. And this is where standpoint theory, some of you may have heard the term intersectionality, that's where that perspective comes in. So your book doesn't talk about that, which is a huge injustice to contemporary sociology, because feminism has had a very big impact on our theoretical perspectives and our viewpoints in contemporary sociology. The last perspective, which sometimes is considered a more minor perspective, it comes also out of social psychology, is exchange theory. Exchange theory is based on a mathematical formula that says benefits equals rewards minus cost. And so an exchange theorist is going to make the case that any action that we do is an action that's going to be designed to maximize our benefits. And when people make those decisions, they are balancing rewards and cost. So for any action that we engage in, we are balancing the cost and rewards of that action. And they argue that people will go with whatever action gives them the most benefit. And the key question that exchange theorists are going to ask is cui bono, which is Latin for who benefits. Think about this. Some of you all just had an exchange theory moment. You were thinking about signing up for a summer class. Some of you were like, well, I'm unemployed right now, so what else do I have to do? And so a benefit was that right now you're unemployed, you could focus, but a cost might be your kids are at home with you, and how are you going to manage your kids? A benefit might be you get the credits and you really need them. A cost might be you wanted to do it face to face, but it was online. And what you're going to do is you're going to weigh these. And you're in the process of weighing these, you're going to try to go with whatever gives you the most benefit with the least amount of cost associated with it. So that's exchange theory. So I just don't feel like your book really did a good job explaining that. I want to take some extra time to talk about symbolic interactionism. I don't usually use this book. I use another book, but I like to preview some parts of chapter 4, which is the chapter on social psychology in the textbook you have and the textbook I generally use. So symbolic interactionism has a lot of different theoretical perspectives that fall under it. These are different types of symbolic interactionist theories. One is called ethnomethodology. Ethnomethodology looks at everyday taken for granted norms. So one great example of that is this idea of your elevator etiquette. So I always do this with my students. I say, what's the first thing you do when you walk into an elevator? And a lot of people say they pushed a button. But that's not true. You step into the elevator, you're in the elevator, and the first thing you really do is you turn around. You turn around. You don't push the button like that, right? You have to turn around to push the button. And so that is an everyday, taken for granted norm. One that you don't really think about. One that an ethnomethodologist would study. And the ethnomethodologist, they often study those taken for granted norms by creating breaching experiments. A breaching experiment is one where you break the norm intentionally to try to see how people respond to that norm. And so if you think about the elevator experiment, you could go in and you don't turn around and see what people do on the elevator. Maybe they get off the elevator. Maybe they run the other way. One of my students said, I'm out at the next floor. Like, it is odd behavior. And because these norms are taken for granted, we don't really think about it until we're in that moment. The same is true with norms of personal space. I find that very interesting to think about in the time of COVID, because we have asked for a radical shift in the norms of personal space, right? Our old norm of personal space was the arm's length away norm. Now it's 6 feet, which is about 2 arms. And people are struggling with that, right? People are struggling with staying 6 feet away because for so long we've had this taken for granted norm, and now every day we're trying to set a new norm and we're breaking the old norm, and a lot of us are breaking the new norm too. And that's a really fascinating thing to think about as we talk about symbolic interactionist perspectives. One of my favorite symbolic interactionist perspectives is the dramaturgical approach. This is Erving Goffman. And Goffman was interested in comparing our human interactions to those in a play. So for Goffman, he felt that life was like a play and we were all actors in this play. So when you think about it, what he's doing is comparing our daily life to the same interactions that we would have in any play that we put on. So imagine, you are an actor. actors in a play, they're going to have two types of behavior. One is called front stage behavior, and the other one is called backstage behavior. All right, so let me go step back a little bit further. Goffman argued that everybody had a front. Your front is the public image that you're trying to maintain. So I know I sound like Pharrell. Some of you all are too young to even know who Pharrell is, but Pharrell had a song about how he was fronting. Well, it came to mean something that Goffman didn't mean it to mean. It came to mean that you're sort of being fake. But your public image, the image you want to convey to people, that's your front. So front stage behavior is your public behavior. The behavior that you engage in when everybody's looking, it's what you want the world or the audience to see, right? So like if you're in a play, when you're putting on the performance, that's the front stage behavior. Backstage behavior, on the other hand, is our behind the scenes behavior. The things that you don't really want people to see. So you get up in the morning and you pick your teeth. Oh, don't I look all gross when I do that? Make sure your underwear are straight and your bra's on right. Those are backstage behaviors. You don't come to class and do that. You don't wipe your behind in the middle of class, right? You don't pick well, some of y'all might pick your teeth in the middle of class, but people would make fun of you for doing that, right? Because that's considered backstage behavior. That's considered private behavior. So in a play, for example, the backstage behavior is a behavior that's not for the audience, like setting up the props, putting on your costume, rehearsing your lines. Those are backstage behaviors. So what I find interesting as a sociologist is if everybody's trying to maintain this front, which they try to maintain through their front stage behavior, what happens when people don't maintain their front? And we have a word for that. And the word for it when you don't maintain your front is you lose face. You lose face. So not maintaining your front causes you to lose face. And what usually happens when people lose face is we automatically go then into what we call saving face. And saving face is where you try to regain your front. So for example, my head is itching right now. And I really don't want to be on camera itching the top of my head. And I don't really know why my head is itching, but it genuinely is itching. And I've been trying to not itch it during this entire video. And the reason I'm trying not to do it is because it's not how I want the video to look, right? It's not the front that I want to maintain for this video. So in order to save face, I'm very thoroughly explaining to you why I'm scratching my head, right? And maybe I might tell you, I don't think I have dandruff. I might try to do something that makes me look a little better, a little more polished. If you go to the bathroom, some of you all have had this happen, especially if you have ever worn a skirt. Some of the young women in the group will understand what I'm talking about. I suppose if you're a guy and you've worn a kilt or you've worn a skirt as well, you might understand. You go to the bathroom and you come out, especially if you have a big frilly dress or something, and you don't realize it, but you've accidentally, and I've done this, tucked your dress into your underwear or your tights or your pantyhose or whatever you got on, and you realize at some point that you have been walking around with your butt out the whole time. And in that moment, when you realize that, you lose face, right? Because you don't want to be the butt out girl. You don't want to be that butt out person. Or you walk out of the bathroom and you have that toilet paper stuck to your foot. You don't want to be the guy who just walked out of the bathroom. When those things happen, you lose face. But here's what's fascinating. When people lose face, a lot of times it's not just an individual thing, it's a collective thing. Other people don't want you to really lose face either. So one of the things that happens is other people will try to help you save face, right? And some of them will do it by trying to ignore what you've done, like, or ignore that your dress is tucked in your underwear. Or they will try to politely or quietly suggest that you pull it out, and say, oh, don't worry, I've had that happen to me. And in that moment, they're trying to help you save face. Maybe you try to help yourself save face by laughing at it. So I try to help myself save face for my itchy head by explaining to you all that my head was itchy and this is why. That's me saving face. I don't want to be the itchy head professor, so I'm trying to save face in that moment. This is great for any of you who want to go into public relations or marketing. If you think about many of these public figures like a Tiger Woods who lost face when he cheated on his wife and he had this all-American squeaky clean image, if you want to have that job of helping people revamp their image. I'm thinking this week a good example of that. I'm recording this in June, and we're in the middle of these massive protests. And I noticed that there was a rumor circulating, and I guess it's not true. I haven't researched it thoroughly to find out, that Wendy's donated a whole bunch of money to Donald Trump. And right now, Donald Trump, his campaign is not very popular with a lot of Americans. And so I noticed that Wendy's has hired a PR firm to say, no, we didn't do that. And not only are we not going to do that, we're going to donate $500,000 to XYZ. I don't know what they're supposedly donating to. They're trying to save face, right? It didn't look good because the tide has sort of turned against the president. And so many people felt like, Wendy's, they were going to boycott it, and they were saying whatever they were going to say. And I'm not asking for your political opinion. One of the things I want everybody to understand is we're all entitled to our political opinion. But clearly Wendy's felt that they needed to save face because they hired a PR firm, and they wouldn't have done that if they felt that way. I think about that with the police officers now who are going to be charged in this murder as well. They've really lost face, right? You don't want to be that person with the image of a murderer. So I'm curious how their attorneys and how their families and how they themselves are going to try to save face, because now they have this label because there's a video of them doing something terrible, right? So anytime something bad happens, whether it's something very serious, like in the example I just mentioned, or tucking your skirt into your underwear, something less serious, people go into the saving face mode. All right, next example of a symbolic interactionist perspective would be this idea of the Thomas Theorem. The Thomas Theorem is also called definition of a situation. W.I. Thomas is the guy who came up with this, and he said, if we define our situations as real, they are real in their consequences. So the Thomas Theorem argues that if we have perception of the world, our perception is just as important as what the real truth is. And boy, are we in a moment to talk about this Thomas Theorem. I think we should talk about it with the coronavirus and what's going on here. There are people who are saying, and they are incorrect, let's just get that out on the table, that it is a hoax, that it is all made up and there's no such thing, and Bill Gates did it, or some wacky stuff. Those people are defining that situation as not real. So if they don't believe it's real, and you may have tried to convince somebody you know about this, that it's real, right? If they don't think it's real, they're going to act accordingly. So they're going to keep going out. They're going to keep visiting their friends, right? If they define the situation as real, it's going to be real in its consequences. In this case, if they define the situation as false, we're going to have some real consequences as well. And I keep thinking about how much our perception shapes our behavior and our reality. Right? And that's what the Thomas Theorem is about. If you perceive something to be true, you will act as if it is true. And that's where the Thomas Theorem gets us. Two other sort of things to think about when we talk about this would also be to think about the development of the self. And if we talk about Mead, the I and me theory, that would be an example of one of these symbolic interactionist perspectives as well. If we talk about Charles Horton Cooley, who's also mentioned in chapter 4, that would be another example of a symbolic interactionist theory. Cooley came up with the idea of the looking glass self, the idea that we get our sense of who we are based on how other people respond to us. So we get our sense of who we are based on how other people respond to us. So if you all tell me, you're a great teacher, you're wonderful, I'm going to think that about myself. If you all tell me you're boring and you're terrible, I'm going to start to think that about myself. So it shows sort of in a very powerful way, other people do what we call in sociology, they do reflected appraisals. And we take those appraisals in and we evaluate ourselves based on how other people respond to us. So a lot of who we are comes from the feedback that we get from other people. And that's what the looking glass self refers to. The I and me theory and the play stage and the preparatory stage and the game stage, we've already talked about those if you're in my face-to-face class. If you are in an online class, you can go to chapter 4 and learn more about Mead's perspectives on the development of the self. So I've gone on and on for about 30 minutes here. The last half of this is reviewing symbolic interactionist theories. The first half is going over the major theories in sociology. I really want you to understand what those theories are and be able to use real life examples of them. Thank you very much. Hopefully I'll see you next week for chapter 2 or in the next module for chapter 2.